how are we going to like do the good work, but also take care of our souls in the process so that we don't either burn out and quit or become so hardened and disillusioned that nobody's listening to us anyway.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Our show is powered by you, the listener. If you want to support the work that we do, get early access to episodes, episode guides, and more, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture to become a monthly patron, so that we can continue in this important work. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to be notified when new episodes come out each week. And go leave a rating and review. It's easy. It only takes a second, and it helps us find new listeners to the show. Just go to the show page on the app that you're using right now and hit 5 stars. It really is that easy. Thank you so much. You know what else would help us out? Share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network. Tell them how much you enjoy it and let them know that they should be listening as well. If you're new here, welcome. If you want to dig deeper, find us on social media at Shifting Culture Podcast, where I post video clips and quotes and interact with all of you. Previous guests on the show have included Sarah Bessie, Grace Hammond, and Amber Haynes. You go back, listen to those episodes and more. But today's guest is Shannon K. Evans. Shannon K. Evans is the author of the books The Mystics Would Like a Word, Feminist Prayers for My Daughter, and Rewilding Motherhood. With interest in ecofeminism, contemplative practice, and social change, Shannon leads workshops and retreats across the country that spark curiosity and compassion. She has partnered with the Jesuits of Canada and the U.S. and is a frequent contributor to Franciscan Media. Having previously lived in Indonesia for 2 years, Shannon loves to travel, but is happiest at home on the Iowa prairie with her family and beloved chickens. In this episode, Shannon K. Evans takes us on a fascinating journey through the lives and teachings of radical female mystics from history, and explores how their wisdom and practices can speak powerfully to our lives and faith today. We'll dive into topics like the importance of art and creativity, caring for the environment, mental health, and finding balance between action and contemplation. So join us as we listen to what the mystics of the past have to say to us today. Here's my conversation with Shannon K. Evans. Shannon, welcome to Shifting Culture. Thank you so much for joining me. Excited to have you on.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to get to talk to you.
I would love to just know the impetus for this book. The mystics would like to have a word. They need to give us something here. We want to learn from these radical women in the past. Why this book? I mean, you talked briefly in your introduction, history is not your thing. So why looking at the past and the history so that it can inform our faith today?
Yeah, it started for me a few years ago. I was just really like disillusioned with everything that I was seeing, in Christianity. I mean, a lot of people feel that way, since like 2016, especially. And, I think I really was looking for a reason to believe that I still belonged here. And so I started reading. I was familiar with several of the women that I cover in the book, but I hadn't read them extensively, or at least not anytime recently. So I started with Teresa of Avila, and I just was immediately hooked. And I just found this resonance that felt like, not just with her, but with many, if not most of them, it felt like this resonance of reading books that could be written today, but their language is different. Obviously, the way that they phrase things were different, but I was surprised by how relevant it felt. And it felt like, oh, there is this ancient practice of Christianity that really is much deeper and richer than I was giving it credit for. And it kind of convinced me to stick around, I think.
Oh, that's amazing that you were able to find some of that stuff. And why do you think it it's really difficult to uncover some of this stuff? And why do we forget that it's already here.
Right. I think it's so easy to like, kind of feel superior in our modernity and feel like, oh, like everything is like evolution is always positive, right? Like, and so, or we tend to kind of idealize just like parts of history, but really going back, and for me, I'm Catholic, and so like I was very familiar. I'm in circles where these women's names are used a lot more frequently than for most Protestants. But like I found that like most books about them, most of the like lore about them was kind of formed by the male voice and male theologians and male perspective. And so when I went back and I actually was reading their words as they themselves wrote them, I was really shocked by how different I understood it from my own female lens than how it had been presented.
I believe it's important for me to be able to view something through a different lens than my own. It creates curiosity and empathy, and it helps me get new perspectives and things that I probably wouldn't see just from my lens. But just for our audience, why is it important for us to read things through different lenses, specifically the female lens, if you're a male?
Right. Oh gosh. Okay. So the best way I can describe it is to give an example, right? So one of the mystics in the book who ended up being my favorite is Marjorie Kemp. And she's one of the lesser known ones, she's not like the Teresa of Avila or whatever. But she is very well documented. She actually wrote the first memoir, possibly in recorded history, but definitely in the English language. And so I was finding a lot about her, and I was reading about how she was just like really courageous and did this like years long pilgrimage, and she just felt like this spiritual calling, and but she was a mother of 14, and just the way that she wrestled with it, which was great, right? That's a great story. But once I started reading her words, one of the first things that became clear to me was that she was a victim of marital rape many times over for years. And that was not a part of her story that had been presented at all in anything that I read until I actually read her own words. And I was just floored by that, of like how that could have been overlooked or just kind of dismissed as like a sign of the times or like the way things were back then or whatnot. But I thought it was really interesting that had never been noticed or examined in anything published that I had read. And so, but as a woman, it immediately jumped out to me as one of the most important things about her life that formed her and kind of influenced maybe some of the choices that she made later. So, like, I think there's a lot of things that can be missed when only one perspective is the filter through which we see something, and that can go a lot of different ways, for the interpretations of her life that lean more conservative than my own. I still learn from them, and I still build a bigger and I think better worldview by kind of incorporating all of that.
You recently recorded the audiobook for this. So what stood out afresh as you were reading your own words? What jumped out to you and go, oh, that impacted me different than like way back when you actually wrote the words?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of it, honestly, I was like, oh, as an author, you like go back and you're like, oh, I would have said that differently or like whatever. But as far as like bigger themes, I think I felt a curiosity about different ones that I hadn't necessarily felt as strongly when I was writing them. So one of them is Hildegard, right, who is another one of the more famous ones. And I wrote a chapter on art making inspired by her because she was such a creative woman and just had all kinds of pursuits: music, science, obviously literature, but also medicine, and just she's incredible. But I was like, wow, I maybe it's because it was this week where, I don't know when this is going to air, but this is the week where Joe Biden resigned. Kamala's getting a lot of like energy in the country. We're coming off the RNC and Trump getting shot, and so there's just a lot of where it's feeling like an election year now, and so a lot of what I wrote in that book was kind of why make art when the world is on fire? Like what is the point of creative pursuits when other things feel so much more important? And kind of like listening to myself read the words of like, oh, this does matter. Like putting this book out in election year, like it's not political, but it is, because art is political, right? And our creative lives are political. And even just it kind of like buoyed my spirits a little bit of like, oh, this really matters right now at this point in history, because like empowering women to claim their own voices really matters right now as they like really take seriously their vote and how they are going to be involved in our democratic process. And so, yeah, I think that really kind of stuck out as like, oh, this might be a year for me to revisit Hildegard a little bit and kind of really light a fire under my butt.
Great. Well, then let's dive a little deeper in Hildegard and art and the importance of art. And so what did you learn from Hildegard where the importance of art, especially in shaping culture and like being a subversive witness in the world? Like, what is art and why is it so important to our society? All Nations Kansas City has 2 exciting events with Jamie and Donna Winship coming up. Join us on September 13th for our annual fundraiser, Further Together, with Jamie and Donna as our main speakers. Did you know that God is on the move all around the world? You will hear stories about people receiving their true identity from God and impacting nations. And you will be invited to join us so that more stories like these can happen and we can see peace in the midst of conflict. The following day, September 14th, Jamie and Donna will be doing their identity exchange workshop. Join us to discover your true identity and experience a life of joy, peace, and freedom. You can register for both events at allnations.us.
For most of us, I would say it can be really intimidating to identify as an artist, and for a lot of people, even as a creative person. Actually, it's funny, when I was recording the audiobook, I was talking to a woman who was there helping with the process, and we were having lunch, and she was like, oh, I'm just really not a creative person at all. And I found myself being like, I'm really not either. I'm like, and then later I was like, what am I talking about? Like, I'm a writer, that is creative. But we kind of get these ideas in our head. We were in a building that was surrounded by visual art, right? So, we get this idea in our head that like, oh, if we're not a painter or a musician or whatever, then, we have these such limited ideas. And one thing that I do really love about Hildegard is that everything was so integrated for her. She did these incredible drawings, but she also studied medicine and, gynecology, like it was just really all connected to her. And I think that that's such a beautiful and important way of how we could see ourselves, of someone who, if they really enjoy and love like creating dinner parties for people, like that is art, that is a creative offering to give to your community. And or even, gardening, all of these things that kind of we don't put into the box of creativity. But I feel like that can be really self-limiting. And in a time when, like, I just think more than ever, the world is just like asking everyone to be their most full, whole selves. Like, this is the time to like bring it all to the table, And so I think that's what really inspires me about her, is that like whether she's composing music or whether she's, mixing up some herbal remedy for someone's ailment, like it's all part of her expression of her personhood. And I want to be more like that.
I want to touch on Hildegard a little bit more, But before we do that, I just wanted to give a couple of definitions. So when we were talking about mystics and we were talking about what are mystics and why are we looking at these women, I think it's just good to frame something a little bit. I think it would be helpful.
The way I use the word is pretty broad. So like the 6 women who were included in the book, some of them did have what we know as like mystical ecstasies where they kind of like lose touch with reality, or like visions where there's some documented like stigmatas and levitating and stuff. But there's also ones like Therese of Lisieux who like led a really regular life, and just a really kind of quote unquote boring small life. And but she's still considered a mystic because of the way that she postured herself in prayer and with Christ. And it was just, for her, she was just all in, like she had tasted the divine and she was like, this is what life is about. And this is like my pursuit. And so I think that a lot of us are mystics and maybe like hesitate to self-identify that way. But I think especially now, if you're a person who feels valid critique of Christianity, right, but you don't want to leave, it's like, you're gonna have to be a mystic. And like, you're gonna have to just like find this like inner well, find your own way of encountering God and of really practices that work for you, for listening to God, for being still, and also putting that kind of contemplation into action is a really important part in the world. So yeah, I mean, I don't think that we're all going to be like experiencing these supernatural events necessarily, although, from time to time they do happen. It's cool. But I think like mysticism is something that is available to everybody who actually wants it, who desires it.
Go back to Hildegard a little bit. We talked about the importance of art and creating art in the world, but you also write a whole chapter as she's walking through environmental justice. How does that play out as a practice for her that we can learn from?
She used this word. I think that she actually kind of coined the term. It's the Latin is viriditas, and it means the greening power of God, the greening. And I love it because it's like, it connects us to, every writer has just like nailed the metaphor of, the seasons, right? Of like the leaves are falling and just like the, changing seasons in my own life or whatever. So we can all kind of make that leap. But even in a small way, like when you take, like if you take like sort of a meditative prayer walk or something, and you can kind of see the tiny, almost undetectable ways that nature is changing, or that something is happening, like the moss is starting to emerge after winter, or there's like a little bud, or in the the end of fall and like everything's dead. I don't know, just like these ways that we are kind of reminded and grounded in the cycles of the earth, that kind of greening, that like always evolving, always growing, always changing is also happening in us. And so Hildegard does a really beautiful job of like connecting the earth, who she sees as an extension of God, the way that humanity is, not something that we are to dominate or necessarily even steward, but like that we are to live in relationship with, and as kind of part of the divine life. And so I think my biggest takeaway in writing that chapter, the very real, valid work that needs to happen around environmental justice has to be anchored in something deeper. And Hildegard really offers us that. And I think that the biggest thing is like, she kind of extinguishes this like myth of we are having dominion over this creation, and she brings it more into like, it is an extension of us. It is, St. Francis, brother, sun, sister, moon, that, it is something that we receive from the part of God's being, really.
What's something for you, maybe in that chapter or in other chapters in your book, that you go, wow, I love what she was doing in this piece. This is a practice. This is something I want to implement within my own life, to create something and have them basically mentor me into this way of being in the world. What stood out for you personally that you wanted to take, and then how have you implemented that within your own life?
Yeah. Catherine of Siena is the sixth one in the book, and the first chapter on her is balancing action contemplation. And I went into it. I really knew nothing about her, but that I knew that she was really a woman of action. She just spent her life on, caring for the sick and the dying and the imprisoned, and she was somebody who I just really looked up to, the very little I knew about her. But I was like, oh, but she was also, such a spiritual woman that I'm sure she's got all of this to teach me about, like the balance of action and contemplation. And then when I started reading, I was like, the first 3 years after she took her vows, she like spoke to no one and just lived in like this tiny little, like 3 by 5 foot room in her parents' house, and would like leave to go to mass and then come home, and she would just pray. And so she goes from that to then, like, I forgive me, I can't remember exactly how it happened, whether she just like decided or whether she felt like God had really spoken to her. After that 3 years, when she decided she was going to like be a woman who was quote unquote of the people, she was going to be in the world, then it was like this total 180. And it was just like one of her biographers said, like, she literally was never alone. And anyway, so I found this fascinating, and she ended up dying an early death. I think she really, for a lot of reasons, wore herself out, which I go into more in the book. But there was something that was kind of comforting to me about that, of like this person who I thought had it all figured out. Like, turns out she sucked at that as much as we all do. It's like, I feel like I'm always either swinging to one side, the pendulum's going one way or the other, of like, either I'm like doing nothing but like focusing on my own inner growth or my own, home life or whatever, or I'm just like way out there and not resting and just burning myself out, And I think especially really in such a politically charged year, that's a real danger for a lot of us. And so really, I think I don't know if I want to say failure. I'm really high on my horse here. But like her failure to achieve that is really instructive for us, And I mean, kind of the way that she did pass away really young. I think she was in her early 30s, and for example, her mother lived to her 80s, so she probably would have. And what could she have done? Kind of found a little bit more balance, a little bit more self-care in the good work that she was doing. I found that really exciting, really, about the women, was that they weren't just like these cookie cutter perfect models, but they were human. And like sometimes you could see their weaknesses or their flaws, maybe that they couldn't even see at the time. But that was one that I think is real wisdom for us right now, especially this year, of like, okay, how are we going to like do the good work, but also take care of our souls in the process, so that we don't either burn out and quit or become so hardened and disillusioned that nobody's listening to us anyway.
So in your active participation in the world, are there any contemplative practices that help ground you? And what have you implemented within your own life in the contemplative space?
I really pray with my body. And so using activities, also I have ADHD, so that might have something to do with it, of like my husband will like literally sit and like meditate like not move, and I'm like, I would be asleep in 5 seconds, like I can't. And so yeah, things like yoga, taking walks, doing breath work, even like I have this altar in my room that just has a bunch of things that I can touch and hold. And, I mean, like I just find that like I need that sort of sensory grounding. And that's been like a really wonderful piece of information to have about myself, because for so long it was like, well, I could either journal and write, or I can try to pray and fall asleep. So, but now I'm like, oh, I have so much more at my disposal. And so one of my favorite things really has been, I'm lucky enough to live with woods behind my house. And so I can take walks. And that has just been such a beautiful way to pray for me. And honestly, like, maybe it's more obvious to some people that that's valid or that you can do that. But I think a lot of us are just like, we kind of see it as like, okay, you sit in your room or you sit in this one chair or whatever, but yeah, those are a few things.
Wow, that's probably my number one thing. If I could do that, if I could walk in the woods and just like be with God in the midst of my walk in the woods, like that's it. Like I love that space. Like it's so important for me to get out there. And when I don't have it and I feel it. And so it's really
You live anywhere
important.
Close to woods?
No.
Oh, man.
I grew up in the Seattle area. We had woods really close. Like my mom, they still live there. My mom's in the woods every single day and going for walks. And, that's her temple. And so she loves it. And when I go visit, I'm there, hours a day, but I just don't have it. And I feel it.
Yeah, I bet.
So it's like, how do I get outside? How do I be able to take my shoes off, feel the earth, be grounded? It's really, really good.
A few years ago, my husband and I tried to start doing like semi-annual retreats. And so like finding retreat centers that do have that, like especially before we moved out here. But I mean, even still, we have 5 kids, so life is crazy. But but yeah, just like taking a long weekend and going to a retreat center where we can just like have that silence. And ideally, we usually choose some place that has like some beautiful nature or desert or, just something to kind of activate that part of us. Yeah.
Yeah, I lived on the edge of the desert. So it doesn't do much for me. I lived in the Middle East for a while, and beauty.
I would not be a desert dweller voluntarily. No, I would not. But some people love it.
I was like, God, I love the mountains and the trees. Thank you for letting me live here in this ugly place. It was spiritually beautiful, but it was it was an ugly place. So go back. I mean, if you're talking, I want to talk a little bit more about Marjorie Kemp, and you talk a little bit in her story. So you have her memoir. She's able to see her story, but talk about mental illness, mental health in the midst of these practices and the ways that we could be, with God and find our way to Him.
Marjorie Kemp had, after her first baby, she had probably what would be diagnosed as postpartum psychosis now, and lasted, I think, about 8 months, and really terrifying stuff, like to read about. It was like really terrible, like visions of, demons and Jesus. But knowing what we know about medicine, it's like, it was, she was not functional. She was laid out in bed. She couldn't care for her baby. It was really, really difficult stuff. And then for the rest of her life, she was tender. She was a tender little thing. She would cry a lot, and she just, people thought she was weird and crazy and overly dramatic and, just unhinged. And I just found I loved her so much because I just felt like I love a woman who's just like gonna be unashamedly what she is, like publicly. But she could have just stayed home, like, and not done anything and sort of not been, the brunt of public scorn. But she didn't. She was like, no, like she believed in her own worth, and she believed that God had called her to preach to people, to tell about God on the streets, and to take these pilgrimages. And she's really, really a model in a lot of ways for just trusting yourself and finding your own worth, no matter what people say about, your mental conditions and stuff. But yeah, she really, I think, speaks a lot to the role of the prophet. And I think, my tongue-in-cheek title of that chapter is "All the Best Prophets Are Mentally Ill." But it's kind of true, right? like we look in the Bible and we see these prophets who are doing these like wacky stuff, And like, we're in these churches that don't bat an eye. They're like, yep, that was the word of God, like golden fire over your poop or whatever. Whereas now it's like, if someone is like remotely shows any sign of, mental health, I don't know, abnormality or whatever, speaking for myself as somebody with, depression and ADHD and everything, we are really skeptical and we kind of dismiss that. And especially I feel like in church leadership, we really are really scared of people who feel unpredictable or maybe out of our control. And I just think our church has suffered so much from the loss of that. And I mentioned in that chapter of like how so many other cultures around the world of other religions or indigenous cultures really have kind of carved out places of honor and respect for those people, for people who are just different and march to the beat of their own drum, but like really have prophetic things to say to the community. And I just think, gosh, so often the gift that comes, like, mental health stuff has been part of my life my whole life. So I'm not saying this as an outsider. I'm including myself, but like, it's hard and it sucks. But like, the gift of it is that we tend to see things that other people miss, that other people don't see. So it's kind of the canary in the coal mine thing, right? Of like, this is wrong with our society, as somebody who's like neurodivergent and like raising a neurodivergent child. It's like, the problem isn't you, my sweet boy. Like, the problem is like this crazy society that we've made where it's like only a very small percentage of people can comfortably fit. Like, and so I just think, there's such a gift of making spaces to amplify those voices, to listen to them. And I think it's exciting. I think we're kind of starting to get there a little bit. Not mainstream, but I see more and more places carved out where people with bipolar are speaking out about their experience or calling out what they see in our society, or people with autism, which is not mental illness, but people on the outside, kind of letting that perspective shine is only for our good, for sure.
I mean, you give a couple of examples, but what does it look like to make space for the ones that go to the beat of their own drum?
Yeah, good question. I don't know the answer for sure. I think on a small scale, honestly, it's really been meaningful to me to just simply follow voices who are talking about it on social media. That's like bare minimum, something that's really simple to do. But their perspectives has really been impactful for me to kind of to understand what they see. And honestly, I think that demographic of people does such a good job of calling out really toxic and traumatizing behaviors in the church and just kind of calling it like it is. So I think that is one way we can really like elevate those voices. That's really simple. Like, you don't have to be the pastor of a church to be able to follow people on Instagram or whatever. But yeah, I think like people in church leadership of really listening and making space. I think I have just been adjacent to a lot of people being dismissed if they come to a pastor of a church or pastoral staff, if they are kind of known to be unpredictable, or if there is a mental health concern that hasn't been addressed, then it's like the entire thing gets dismissed really easily. Any complaint that they have is like not taken seriously. So I think like returning that, taking effort, like with any person, taking it all with a grain of salt, taking it like nobody is infallible. But really kind of considering that maybe that there are critiques that are being seen by people who do have an antenna that maybe the, type A put together pastor of the church might not have. And he actually needs those voices, or she might need those voices to listen to too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's good. Hey, we should just have a bunch of anchorites and just live in it.
Yes. No room in the church.
Yeah, that's right. Little room, little
Yeah.
cell, let them go. People could walk by and ask some questions.
Don't you love that? Like Julian of Norwich, she just like opens her little window and people
Oh my
just walk
gosh.
up with their problems.
No, when I first was hearing her story and reading about her and her being an anchorite, I was like, no way is that going to would be my story. Like, I can't do it, but I'm impressed. I'm very impressed that she could do it, but there's no way.
Yeah.
So what were some of the things that came out as you were reading Julian of Norwich, and what really stood out to you?
A couple of things. She was also one of the earliest ones that was like, that kind of blew my mind when I read. For one thing, she talks so much about God as mother and Jesus as mother. And I feel like a lot of people don't know that. And a lot of people could feel really threatened by feminine imagery of God. But, this woman, centuries ago was writing this, and she was like considered the holiest woman, in the land. Where, like you said, people would come from all over. Marjorie Kemp actually came and visited her when she went on pilgrimage. So, yeah, I think that was that really brought me to tears, because that was at a point like 5 years ago where I was just really desiring that so much. Of like, I needed really to relate to God as a mother. And a lot of spaces were telling me that I didn't have permission to do that. And so then to find that in such an old, respected text was just incredible to me. So, and it's not just once. I mean, it's over and over again. And then the other thing about her that I really loved was she really, like, I think much to her chagrin, like, found that sin and hell weren't as important as she had been taught that they were. She even was like, I don't really know what to do with this, because the church has taught me this, but like in all of my visions, like, I'm not really seeing that, like there was this discrepancy for her. And she had this really lovely way of looking at sin, where she was like essentially saying sin doesn't exist. It's the effects of sin, the harm that sin does, that exists. And that's, but she has this kind of beautiful reasoning behind it. But I think what I took away from it was that, like, God, it's a waste of time to fixate on, it's such a waste of time to fixate on our sin or hell or what happens after we die. But it's just like, we can just fixate on these things that we can't know and that honestly don't seem to make us a lot healthier when we do fixate on them. Or like in her experience, when she actually encountered God, and for us, whether that's, the kind of visions that she had or in our just regular everyday life, but just encountering God is really so much more about love and relationship and hope. And there was a lot of hope in her writing. And I think just like the absence of the doomsday stuff that she expected that she would see, that a lot of, historically people with visions, it's like, a lot of like the fires and brimstone of hell or whatever, and she was like, I don't know, I thought that's what I would see, but it wasn't there, So I don't know, I think it was just really hopeful. And for people who have been hammered over the head with that, I think that they'll be really happy if, they choose to read that for themselves, because it's refreshing.
I do think that when we hammer people over the head with that, with sin and hell, the ultimate aim, I think, is to live an expansive life of love. And like, that's the aim of like hammering people over the head of like sin and hell. You don't want to do this. But we focus on it so much that it actually constricts the love that we have for other people. Like, we like move inside of ourselves to make sure that I'm doing the right things, that I actually don't see people anymore. And I think sometimes when we look and we start to focus on the expansive love of God for all people, that actually brings us into a space in life where we are actually living out a what others would call a life with a lot less sin.
Yes.
So
isn't that interesting?
yeah. So how do we start then to shift a little bit of the way that we start to talk about life with God? What did you learn from Julian or any of the other women that the way that we talk about life with God brings about love for God and love for other people?
Yeah. The one who comes to mind is Therese of Lisieux, because she had such a simple and down-to-earth message that really just boiled down to, well, God, you like me. That's how I would summarize it. Like, I can just be like your little thing, your little child, and just be loved and delighted in. And, it's like, it's radical because it should so not be radical, but it is. And yeah, so she was one. I mean, I kind of always joke about her because she's the least like me, like personality wise. She was very just precious in every sense of the word. And she died when she was 24. So she never even had the chance her brain didn't even finish developing, she died of tuberculosis. But yeah, like kind of this real, the simplicity of the message of loving, of receiving love, and of living in a way that honors that love toward God, from God, and with your fellow humans. And I just, in her, I see so much peace and just sort of, even though she had a frustrating life in a lot of ways because she was always sick. She passed away early. Her mother died when she was really little. But she wanted to do these great things. She wanted to be a missionary. She wanted to leave the country and be a missionary. She wanted, at different points, she says she wanted to be a priest. And obviously that was not an option available to her. But in all of these kind of big longings, there is like this undeniable undercurrent of peace throughout her writing that I want. And so I'm like, as much as you annoy me sometimes, Therese, like I kind of want what you have, which is just like this, the simplicity of love is really moving. Yeah.
Why does she annoy you?
Because she says stuff like, oh, I'm just like the littlest flower in God's garden. Like, I'm just God's little child. And Jesus, I'm just weak and nothing and helpless. And I'm like, oh, stop it.
But isn't it ironic that the way that she's like, I'm so insignificant, she actually has a lot of significance because of that.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, I have a chapter on that, how she should be like the patron saint of like the influencer generation, because she's just like, I'm nothing, and that's great. Yeah, I love that, because that's like she became one of the most significant voices in Christian history by talking about not being significant and really believing it, not just talking about it. Yeah,
that's so good. I'm a pretty practical person, so I want to know, like, all of this information. I love it. It's great. I could see it. I could start to view God in a different way. I could see God in a different way. I could learn from female mystics and ones that I really have a different perspective and lens. So I need to see something else. But how does it actually impact my life? Does it change the way that I live and interact in the world? And if so, how does it?
I love that. That's a great question. Yeah, I think my goal for the book was to show how relevant these voices were and are for our lives today. Now, granted, Joshua, I wrote the book for women, so you are not necessarily the target audience, but I do also, like, even just rereading it the other day when I was recording it, I was like, oh, like this, I could have easily made this book not for women, because there are a few times when I'm like women specific, but I think in general, like you said, learning from people who are have different experiences, not just similar experiences, is really valuable for all people. But yeah, I would say I think reading their words and trying to forget that they lived in a different generation, which hopefully, if I did my job right, won't be too hard to do for the reader, because I really did try to kind of pull and in some ways translate into like modern vernacular what they're saying. I think being able to forget that, it's kind of shocking how relevant and how practical and applicable the messages of their lives are, whether that's, the need for balancing action and contemplation and like the high stakes of not doing so, or the need to be grounded in our spirituality if we're going to do climate justice, environmental activism. But even like in the case with Teresa of Avila, of like, I didn't even touch on this yet, but one of the chapters is on sexuality and sensuality and spirituality, like how those things go together. And so that's like, it is very theoretical, but it's also just like very human and very everyday life, and how we live in our bodies and how we live out our sexualities in relationship with one another, or as a celibate, like she did. And so, yeah, I think there is a lot of kind of thought like, oh, that like, I'm going to chew on that. But I think it's thought that is actually going to become fleshy in our lives. Like, I think that it is so relevant to specific areas of our lives that it kind of will, my hope is that it integrates pretty naturally into different facets of what we actually experience day to day.
Well, I think one thing that you said, talking about your own spiritual practices, disciplines, you talked about the importance of the body, embodied experience. Can you just briefly touch a little bit, like, what does it look like for us to move from the theoretical and the, like, even the knowledge of God into an embodied experience? What does it look like to actually have a embodied spirituality in our lives, since we are embodied people?
Yeah. Oh, I'm still on the journey, so I'm definitely not speaking as an expert, but for myself, I have found it so valuable and so important. And like I said, just having those physical practices that that get me out of my head. And even like sometimes, as far as practices go, sometimes I'll just be feeling so much, not even like quote unquote spiritual, but like thinking too much or like stewing over problems, and I'll be like, oh, I just gotta like move this through my body, and like go on a brief run because I'm not a runner, or like, but sometimes it just feels good to just like get that energy, or like do yoga, and I can kind of almost visually see it going through my body. And for me, I think it has become natural to experience God in that. And when you sort of like are able to, and the same thing with like at my altar, and I have like these things to hold, and I have, rosary beads, or I have like things that I've collected on walks outside that I just kind of like to hold, and, a palm cross or a finger labyrinth or just any of that kind of stuff. But whatever it is, whether jogging or like doing a rosary beads or something, it like there is something that integrates the spiritual and the physical when we're kind of intentionally and mindfully doing that. Because I really do think it's more about the inner posture rather than like the specific practice of whatever you're doing. Yeah, I don't know. That's kind of a convoluted answer.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
Good. No, I think it is actually really helpful and practical, and it's good for us to start to imagine our spirituality as embodied.
Yeah.
And we're not just heads on sticks, that, there's the body is important. I have a couple quick questions here at the end. One, if you go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
my advice to my 21-year-old self would be to trust yourself and don't outsource your spirituality to authority figures. Yeah. I mean, I could elaborate on that, but that's the concise version.
Good, concise version. I like it. That's good. Yeah. Anything you've been reading or watching lately you can recommend?
Oh, that's fun. Well, I have been watching The Bear along with most of America. We just finished season 3 and I just love it. I love like talking about like creativity and art. Like I love the risk of that show is that it is so patient. It is like almost painfully patient and not in a hurry. And like it annoys some people. And I'll be honest, like there are some episodes where I'm like, that's it. That's the end of the episode. Nothing happened. But I think it's like it's so countercultural. And it also is like, if you're paying attention, it like really kind of forces you to ask questions about the characters that hopefully bleeds over into your own life until you start asking questions about yourself and your own family. And, you know, I just think it's just so well done. I love that.
Yeah. I mean, I've watched a couple of episodes. I tried to get in first season with my wife. And then she's like, this is way too anxiety inducing. Like, I can't watch this. Like,
yeah, the first season is so, yeah. And to be fair, the second season too. The third season, less anxiety and more just like, it's so slow. So that's what I mean with like the patience. Yeah. But yeah, the first one is crazy, which I'm like, I think it's like, I don't know if they do this on purpose, but like it feels very, those polarities feel very like representative of food in general, right? Of like the restaurant industry that's like so insanely chaotic and fast. And then there's like the slowness of actually growing food or simmering food or whatever. So I don't know. But yeah, no, I do understand that first season is great.
Yeah. Yeah. So, hey, my wife and I watch shows together. And so like every once in a while I get some time when one of us is traveling and I'm like, so I think The Bear is the next one for me when I'm by myself. My wife is traveling.
Yeah. More time when she's not around.
That's right. Yeah. So how can people go out, get The Mystics with like a word? Where would you like to point people to? How can they connect with you?
Yeah. So it releases, you know, wherever books are sold on September 10th. You can order it from your local independent bookstore is always like a really fun option. And let's see, you can find me on Instagram is where I'm most active social media wise. I'm at Shannon K Evans, and my Substack is the Rewilded Life. So you can find me there, and I write once a week there.
Well, Shannon, thank you for this conversation. Really enjoyed walking through some of these mystics, these women of old that could actually be relevant for our lives today. And so thank you for walking us through that. I really enjoyed our conversation of embodiment and arts and social justice and environmental justice. We went through a lot of different places. And so I really enjoyed it. It was fun. So thank you so much for this.
Thank you for having me. Yeah. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you want to see more episodes like this, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron of the show. You can help us produce more episodes so that we can see the body of Christ look more like Jesus. If you become a patron on patreon.com/shiftingculture, you will get early access to episodes. You will get episode guides. You will get bonus shows, hopefully, and more. So go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron. Also, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us out and helps us find new listeners to the show. And just go and share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network, people that you think would enjoy it as well. Thank you again for listening to the show. I hope you have a great week.